welcoming back to SustainEastBay Club. They are here right now. So we have Sandra Torres, who is our president. Do you want to wave, Sandra, so they know that you're up out here? Yes, okay, cool. We have Nikita Bungera here today. She's our vice president. Adrian Van Dyke is our treasurer. Sarah Smith is our communications specialist, and then I do programming. Sandra Tree, if you could give quickly like a club overview for us.
Sure. Hello everyone, Sharon introduced me. My name is Sandra Torres. The SustainEastBay Club is a student organization under the Office of Sustainability, but we provide student opportunities for everyone on campus, and we do fun activities. A few years ago, well, for a few years until this year, we do campus cleanups. We provide events for students to learn about sustainable opportunities, how sustainable practices can be applied to different fields. And we usually interact with zero waste trainings where we help students learn about waste management, up to hosting talks by faculty and other professionals about raising sustainable topics as we are doing right now. We mostly post events through the club's website called Basync. So if you ever like to know how like to keep yourself updated with the club opportunities, we use Basync as long as with our other social media. Our handle is usually SustainEastBay on Instagram and Twitter if you like to keep yourself updated. Did I get all that, Sharon?
Yes, you did. You made everything. So our handle, as she mentioned, is @SustainEastBay. It's the same on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and I believe YouTube as well. Today we've got a panel together to discuss the fires in California and their effects on the climate crisis and all that kind of stuff. So if the panel could introduce themselves. We have Professor Marks, Professor Garbesi, and Professor Schmeltz. Are they unmuted?
Who would you like to go first, Sharon?
Professor Marks, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself really quick.
Hi everyone, my name's Tony Marks Block, and I am in the Department of Anthropology, Geography, and Environmental Studies, and I study fire.
Cool. Professor Garbesi?
Hi, my name is Karina Garbesi. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program and am deeply dipped in sustainability issues.
Professor Schmeltz?
Yep. Hello, everyone. Michael Schmeltz here. I am in the Health Sciences Department, and I study the impacts of climate change on public health.
Awesome. It's a pretty well-rounded panel. So if Professor Marks, you would like to start us off and just go ahead and enlighten us?
Sure. I did have some slides I wanted to share, so is that that's possible? All right. Great. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today to discuss this extremely relevant topic. I'm going to try and provide some background on fire in California for all of you, historical background, and show you some evidence looking at certain ways to manage fire that might help us avoid some of these large fires that are affecting us today. So, all right. Okay, so I assume everyone can see this. So, certainly climate change will make fuel across California, and that's, you know, woody things, grass, anything that'll burn. It'll make fuel more receptive to fire for longer throughout the year. Flammability will increase. But there are ways to manage the destruction that we're seeing throughout California and we've been seeing for the past few years. And that's really what I want to touch on today, is just to think about solutions. And we can think about solutions by looking often to the past. So in 2018, we saw one of the largest, in 2018, we saw really large fires across California. Of course, this year is turning out to be even larger, the amount of acres or hectares area burned by fires. And we're almost, this year, we're almost getting to the annual fire area that occurred before colonialism in California. 1.8 million hectares is actually a conservative estimate based upon fire histories and dendrochronologies, or evidence of fire scars on trees in California. And so that's what used to burn preceding European colonialism. Now, for example, when fire is suppressed throughout California, as it was between 2007 and 2016, but also beginning especially in the 1920s, the amount of the fire area in California rapidly decreased compared to pre-colonial fire area. And so really there's this huge fire deficit in California. Most of the plants that grow here are adapted to fire, and really number of species need fire in order to reproduce. So we're living in a landscape that has adapted to fire for millennia. And just as a comparison, in 2018, almost 800,000 hectares burned. Just maybe it's a little easier for you to think about. That's about, we're moving toward 1.4, and that's about, I believe 1.4, sorry, I have the math here. That's about 4.4 million acres is about 1.8 million hectares. And so this year we're probably going to get up to 4 million hectares, it appears. Sorry, 4 million acres, or 1.2 million hectares. So there's a fire deficit, and what that does is really create more continuous fuels throughout the state of California, which allow fire to spread really rapidly and easily across the landscape. However, if you reduce the fuel continuity, you create more of a patchy landscape, which prevents fire spread. And that's something to really keep in mind. In the pre-colonial era, California was fuels were much more patchier. And so while there was a lot of fire, it did not spread as rapidly as we're seeing today. And so I know this is a lot of, I'm going to show you a lot of data, but I think it's important to see that this bottom graph is basically the temperature anomalies in California history from the 1600s to present. And then on the top, there's something called a fire index, which is really just the number of fires that are seen in a given year. And so a lot of this data on the upper graph with the black line as the average is derived from fire scars gathered from trees like this one. And you can see those fire scars, and they're dated. And so that's one way that fire historians are able to create these graphs. And so, like I said, fire occurrence and extent. And here at this point, we see a large shift in fire occurrence and extent in California based on this data set from the Sierra Nevada. And what happened at this point in time? Well, Spanish colonialism occurred, and their fire occurrence and extent rapidly increased at this point in time. So what happened? Why? Well, these authors believe that indigenous burning that occurred preceding colonialism had created, as you can see, a pretty consistent fire occurrence and extent. And then as indigenous populations were brought into missions, they no longer were conducting the burns that they relied upon to maintain their livelihood. And so the fuel continuity, or fuels, became much more continuous. And so fires were able to spread at much greater rates and across in much greater areas throughout California due to this disruption. And now on the right-hand side of the graph, just briefly, industrial fire suppression using airplanes and large workforces rapidly decreased fire occurrence and extent in California, beginning primarily in the 20th century. And this is an insert graph on the top right, which just magnifies that section that is really, really low fire occurrence and extent in California since 1900. And we can see more recently, as the climate has changed, as temperatures have increased, because there has been so little fire on the landscape, these things are coupled. So the climate changes and we're seeing increases in fire occurrence and extent. However, not nearly at the same levels as we saw preceding colonialism. So what does this look like when we eliminate fire from the landscape? What happens to our forests? So this is just one example that I think it really illustrates this well. If you take, initially, you'll have a landscape where there isn't a lot of fuel continuity in this top left in 1909. Fire is not gonna, it will certainly spread here, but it will not create such large catastrophic fires that we're seeing today that are really intense and are severe as well. But over time, if you just manage a forest for timber or you exclude fire from the landscape, you're going to get a lot of small trees and a lot more fuel continuity, as you can see in these lower pictures in 1989 and 1997. However, you can manage a forest, like in this other photo from an adjacent forest in 1997, to reduce fuel continuity so that fire does not spread as quickly and so that firefighters can actually safely control fires. So I'm just going to emphasize this again. On the top left, you see a forest that has basically just been left alone. Maybe the timber is being grown and that's the emphasis. And on the bottom, you kind of see a landscape that has been managed, maybe through prescribed burning or through thinning. And fire is not going to be as intense in that landscape. And you can see this visually in a forest. This is actually in Lassen National Forest in the northern part of the state. This area that was thinned and prescribed burned, when a wildfire came through, you can see the area that was untreated left somewhat of a moonscape. And then the other part of the forest, is retaining carbon in particular, as well as other benefits, ecological and social benefits that forests bring. And so just to reemphasize this, if we're not managing our forests to reduce fire spread, we're also losing a lot of carbon when fires do come. And certainly that is one of the mechanisms that will reduce global climate change. Of course, there are other really important actions that we should take that I'm sure maybe Professor Garbesi will discuss. And just, again, a lot of this work comes from a really great scientist named Matthew Hurteau and their team of researchers. But this really just kind of shows you, if you model carbon in a forested system in the American West, if you have different management prescriptions where you thin the forest or you thin and burn the forest or do nothing at all, you can see over the long term, a forest that is thinned and burned, prescribed burned, retains more carbon over time, as well as the other ecological and social benefits that I alluded to earlier. So what is prescriptive burning? Well, here's just a short video from some people that I've been working with in Northern California. These are really low flame lengths. It's very easy to control, and it's not consuming entire trees. So low intensity, high frequency, under moderate weather, so that the fire does not consume everything, and can create a lot of great benefits. In particular for indigenous people in California who rely upon fire to maintain a lot of resources for their everyday life. These women here in the center are holding basketry materials that can only be generated through burning. And so much of the landscape across California was burned in this way to create baby cradles like you see on the left, ceremonial baskets, ceremonial basket caps on these women's head in the bottom left. And then acorns on the right. Acorns were at the foundation of California Indian subsistence and livelihood. And California Indians burned under oak trees throughout the state. In some cases annually, to maintain a healthy oak acorn harvest. And so that is one of the reasons why we see such large amounts of fire preceding colonialism. And I'll just leave it at that, since I think there might be some good conversation later on some of these things that I've touched on, but that's really kind of the context for this conundrum that we're in now, is really around management and what we're using the land for. Are we using it to sustain our lives? Or are we using it to create these large commodities for export, which really in California's case was around timber, and focused on growing more and more trees in many cases. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussion.
All right, I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat, but after all the panelists are done speaking, we are going to open up the room to any questions from the audience. So I think if you could save them until the end, that would be awesome. Professor Garbesi, if you could go next.
Sure, I'm just opening all my avenues back up here, and let me then I've got to move my Zoom screen. I wanted to be able to see what Tony was showing us. So I have now covered up everything that I need to show you. All right, well, I'm going to try sharing my screen here. So I hope you all can see this okay. And I'll find that tiny little thing that's the projector. So can you see my screen okay? Yeah, okay. So this was my assignment from Sharon, to look at the connections between climate change, fire frequency and intensity, and societal energy choices. So the connection, Tony started talking about this, but in terms of the very big picture, under anthropogenic climate change, you expect wet areas to get wetter and dry areas to get drier. And almost everywhere is getting hotter. Therefore, dry areas are tending to get both hotter and drier, hence more prone to fires. And right here, I want to acknowledge that everything that Tony was saying then exacerbates this kind of thing in terms of compounding factors. If you've left areas with these huge fuel loads because you've suppressed fires, right, then you're adding compounding factors. If you add to that the other things that climate change is causing, increased heat waves, increased storm frequency and intensity, increased wind speeds, and deeper and longer droughts, the fire risks are greatly compounded. So these things are working together, the many factors that climate change is creating. And this may remind you of somewhere thinking about heat lightning and a lot of dead trees from years of drought, dry undergrowth, etc. We saw, Australia is a textbook example of this. This seems like 100 years ago in our crisis-fed world now. It was only in December and January when we had the huge fires in Australia. The map on the left here of Australia, which is dear to my heart because I lived here for quite a while. Everything that's orangish in this plot were areas that the temperatures were above normal, and in the year just prior to when the fire started that following month, January through November of 2019, you had very large areas with highest temperatures on record. Almost the entire continent had above average, in a tiny little tippy tip up there, had a little area that was had lower temperatures than normal. You also, at the same time, had records on precip, with the majority of the country having below normal precip, and many areas having record low precips. And this, of course, you probably know, led to catastrophic fires of unprecedented scale in New South Wales, Victoria, and a place called Kangaroo Island. Kangaroo Island, by the way, is this little thing right here, which you can see in both of these photos, which was designed to be a sanctuary for indigenous species in Australia to protect them from all the devastation of what was happening in the mainland. The result was 74 million square miles burned catastrophically, enormous property damage, 1 billion animals killed. And although this particular fire was lower in numbers of people killed than the 2009 fire, which set the record, it was very damaging to the environment, and in particular to indigenous endemic species. 113 species need urgent help as a result, koala bears and wallabies in particular, and half of the 50,000 koalas that were protected on that island were killed by the fire. So these can be devastating, especially among all the other threats that the planet is facing. Interesting to me was this one little observation that the New York Times raised here. A 2008 report commissioned by the Australian government, this is 2008 report as opposed to the 2020-ish fire, predicted that global warming would cause the nation's fire seasons to begin earlier and later and be more intense. That's not so surprising, starting around 2020. We all expect this, right? It's logical. As a matter of fact, in graduate school, one of my colleagues named Margaret Torn, a graduate student with me, she really started looking at the fire risk, enhanced fire risk from climate change in California at that time, and has done a lot of work since. If we look at the US as a whole, this is what's been happening. There's some interesting stuff here. These are two different data sets. Let's look at the contiguous data set from the National Interagency Fire Center. You do see, in terms of area burned during this period, so we're looking at the recent data as opposed to the longer term data that Tony was sharing with us. You see something that looks like a general upward trend if you sit back and squint at it. You also see something kind of interesting happening. I see, if I was going to fit these data before 2000, I'd put a straightish line around here. If I was going to fit these data after 2000, I'd put a straightish line in a very different place. Looks like a step function to me. Are we, have we reached some kind of threshold effect in these areas that are already dry and becoming drier and more prone? Really important concept for us to focus on. As we know now, we're having, record fires for these recent periods. Again, I, harken back to Tony's bigger picture context that we should remember. We have fires spread around, all of California right now that have incredibly high intensity, so intensity in megawatts, that's energy per unit time released by the fire. So these are very intense fires which become hard to control and have all sorts of problems with noxious fumes, toxic smoke. Now eroding all of the air quality benefits actually that we've had since 72. We're losing ground there. Areas burned in the Bay Area have been very large. And again, what we're concerned here is catastrophic burn. It'd be great if there was managed burn, but when you start killing the big trees and having these completely out of control burns, that's when we have a concern. So what do we need to do to contain the bigger picture problem, this existential threat to humanity that is interactive with climate change, both caused by climate change and also contributing to climate change, large-scale fires? Well, what's the primary cause of climate change? I love this plot. This is sort of a new type of plot which has been circulated. The lack of clarity is in the original. My apology. It comes from the United Nations, the United in Science report that is a combination of all the world's major science and climate and meteorological organizations. And it shows that if you just compare 1870 and 2017, this is not a time trend. This is just starting in 1870 and going to 2017, if you look at all the things that contributed to CO2 in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gas that's causing the majority of the problem, though not the only serious greenhouse gas, you can see the contributions that coal added, oil added, and gas added to the atmosphere, cement production less, and then this is land use change. So this is releasing carbon as a result of changing forest to agriculture, for example. And then you can see what pulled carbon back down, regrowth of forests, a lot in these super dense conditions that Tony was mentioning where, the trees are coming up like grass and just this giant thicket, and the ocean sink. Of course, these things, well, that's great that you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. The question is, how should that be managed? This carbon that's being pulled into the oceans, of course, causing a lot of damage, and more than 90% of the energy added to the climate as a result of all these greenhouse gases is also going into the ocean. So we have climate catastrophe going on here. The end point in the atmosphere was that in 2017, we were at 405 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're now over 410, as opposed to its quote pre-industrial, and people take different dates for pre-industrial, but somewhere around 275, 280, whatever. So big changes. What do we have to do to avoid catastrophic runaway warming that is beyond our control? We're concerned here about feedbacks to the system where, because you have a warming, you start releasing all these other, or the same greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, more CO2 from stocks in the ocean, from stocks in tundra, et cetera, from stocks in forests, if you wind up having these enormous runaway fires, for example. What do you have to do to eliminate that and avoid exceeding 1.5 C warming? 1.5 C warming is the international consensus on the not to exceed amount. On the trend we're on right now, we could reach 1.5 C warming by 2032. So actually I can't remember if it's 2030 or 2032 right now. I'm getting two numbers mixed up, but within 10-ish years. In order to avoid that, we've got to bring net greenhouse gas emissions to zero by possibly as early as 2040. And these ranges here are the result of the best estimates of uncertainty, which are not perfect estimates of uncertainty either, I would point out. So this is what we have to do to emissions. That's really sobering when you think that 85%, 86% globally actually of our energy is coming from fossil fuels, which contributes more than 60% of the total warming effect. So this is our challenge right here. In terms of energy technologies, what does this mean? We got to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources, which I will point out would save money as well as lives, justice, and the environment. And we can't do that with nuclear. You can ask me why later. I will go into it. we need to change fossil fuel end uses to electric end uses, mostly because the renewables that we can greatly expand provide energy to us primarily in the form of electricity. So we have to swap, to electric vehicles, to heat pump technologies for heating, air, space and water heating applications. And or to hydrogen produced by renewable energy, for example, for large trucks and aviation. We need to become much more energy efficient. All these technologies are available to us already, which is the good news. And can we get there fast enough? Well, we're losing time to get there. We can do it, but it will require unprecedented global cooperation. And the two biggest emitters right now are raising grave concerns. If you look at this plot is from the United Nations emissions gap report. They issue it annually. It shows gigatons of CO2 on the y-axis, and it shows dates on the x-axis here between 2015 and 2030. This blue line here, this little turquoise blue line, is the line we're on with, quote, current policy scenarios. That means if everyone adheres to their current policies, and I would tell you that those were pre-Trump changes. He's now, well, we'll get there. In theory, if we did that, we would be on this line, right? We need to be on this line here to stay, to not exceed 1.5 C warming. So this is what we call the gap, right? Let's look at emissions now, international emissions. We have some of the big emitters put here. China, these are gigatons of CO2 emitted annually from 1990 to 2018. This is what's happening with China. Still on a sharp upward turn. Admittedly, China's doing more renewables than anywhere else in the world, but they're also doing a lot of fossil fuels and coal because they got a lot of coal. The US, well, this is pretty kind of crappy. Although we're reducing our emissions on a per capita basis, we're not pulling them down overall. Here the US looks like a pretty good comparison with China because we're going down per capita, China's going up, but we still consume a lot more per capita than China does. So there's an equity issue. There's equity issues, there's north-south issues. We have to, work on this together, come to large-scale global cooperative agreements to solve this problem, which means addressing equity issues, economic issues, and environmental issues together. Now, the Trump administration is also scaring the bejesus out of me because it turned around all the environmental law that was trying to control the problem that the Obama administration had put in place, most significantly emissions controls on coal-fired power plants and automobile fuel efficiency standards, and formally withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. This is, to me, a moral outrage. This is mass murder, the results of this, if this is allowed to continue. Many, many, many more people will die horribly because of this. So you can gather my opinions on the next election. Overall, you've got 100 environmental rules that have been reversed by this administration, including nasty toxic chemicals that have been banned for years that you're trying to unban. It doesn't make any sense. So what will need to happen? Well, individual action, absolutely. It's essential, but it is insufficient. It is grossly insufficient at this point. We need a shift in worldview from me to we, right? From hyper-individualist oriented consumer society to community-oriented, planet-friendly, and a socially justice society. As cliche as that sounds, that is absolutely true in a fundamental and deep way. We need a reciprocity-oriented worldview. If you're interested in what Mark's been talking about, Robin Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is wonderful on this feeling of reciprocity. If you want the environment to support you for the long term, if you recognize it as your home, you have to give back what you take. You have to make sure that there isn't net degradation. We need mass political action and a social movement. And Sunrise Movement is my sweet hope on this. It's the young people who are standing up. And of course, there's a much bigger global movement of young people. But in the US, Sunrise Movement is doing it, supporting, and they are involved in this and other groups as well, supporting candidates that support the Green New Deal, which combines social justice goals with sustainability goals, and in particular, fighting the climate problem goals. We need to get money and corruption out of politics. This thing has gotten worse and worse and worse. You think of all these major companies that they used to be at least protecting their consumers, they're no longer doing that. Their whole job is to try to get money for top executives. To the extent that would have been criminal years ago. So we got to clean up government. We got to clean up capitalism. We need an economic shift from this degeneration into these utterly unethical winner-takes-all capitalism to a regenerative, welfare maximizing economics that's closed-looped and socially just, where all environmental social costs are internalized to prices. We need education desperately on the urgency and immediacy of the crisis. I can't tell you, even in recent years, how often I've heard people say, well, if everybody can just do a little. I'm sorry, we are beyond that. We are well beyond that. It's not just if everybody can just do a little. We need to limit population as well as reducing consumption and improving technologies. There's this thing called the IPAC equation, and population times level of consumption times the types of impacts per unit of technology, those things multiply each other. So if we're going to address this problem, we have to address all three. That needs coming to international agreements on that. We need to reinstate our connection to the earth. Taking care of her is taking care of us. We need a planet-centric worldview, which permits no more destruction of the planet. We've used it up. We have to go the other direction now. It's not just sustainability, it's regenerative that we have to be focusing on. And yes, these things are starting to happen. There's this emergence of all these things I've been talking about. But there's also this emergence of this reactionary denial, via this cognitive dissonance reaction where you start justifying insane, positions that you've taken. So there's a psychological part of this too. And I think that's my time. Thank you very much. And I can answer questions if people have them later. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Schmeltz.
Sorry about that. Can you all see my presentation? Is it full screen?
Yes.
All right, sorry about that. All right, thank you very much, both to Professor Marks and Professor Garbesi for the background and some of the solutions-oriented talks about wildfires. So today I want to have a discussion particularly about the wildfires, climate change, and the public health impacts associated with the fires. All right. I'm having a little technical issue here. Give me one moment.
Michael, if you want to email me your thing, I can also put it up on my screen if it doesn't work.
I think I got it now. Sorry about that.
Good.
So as the other speakers had spoken about just very briefly, talking about wildfires, its connection to global warming and climate change, right? So first we have this phenomenon of global warming, in which we understand the addition of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere contributes to a warming globe. This and then sort of results in the impacts of climate change, right? And we sort of experience that warming in various ways through our weather system, in heat waves, droughts, floods, and as we've seen here, in wildfires. And we've seen from Professor Marx's presentation that the uptick in sort of average global temperature, we saw an uptick in the number of wildfires that we have seen as well, right? And so we're concerned about these climate impacts because they don't just impact our environment, but they impact the people who live in those environments and thus cause potential harm to the environment and our health. So climate change has been described as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, right? So we're connecting issues around the environment and climate change as impacting our human health as much as any other chronic or acute disease that we've seen in history. And we know from studies, from experience, that climate change impacts not only impact our physical health, right, from flooding, from heat waves, from wildfires directly impacting ourselves, but we also know that they have impacts to our mental health and impacts to society as a whole and community health, increasing social instability, decreasing community cohesion, things of that nature. So we need to think about the impacts of climate change, not just impacting our environment, but also how that is sort of affecting us as individuals and community members of society. So what I wanted to focus on in particular here was the acute and chronic effects of wildfire smoke, right? So the main effects of wildfire smoke that we experience are due to particulate matter. So you may have heard of that, right? What we are really concerned about is fine particulate matter, which we dub PM 2.5, right? And this is the particulates that we are able to breathe in and go deep inside our lungs that cause health impacts to not just our respiratory system, but also impacts to our cardiovascular system, cerebrovascular system, etc. So that breathing in of those particles is damaging our health. And this is experienced a lot more when we see an increase in the number of wildfires, and that wildfire smoke sort of permeating not just the area where the fire is, but permeating large swaths of area as we're seeing here now, right? So we see that wildfire smoke can have acute effects in our respiratory and cardiovascular systems, but we also know that sort of the continual inhalation of particulate matter has long-term effects as well, right? And this can increase the incidence of lung disease, heart disease, various chronic conditions such as diabetes and kidney issues, as well as certain cancers that we've seen connected to particulate matter. So in thinking about how climate change impacting the increase in wildfires, we need to also be concerned about sort of the main effect is this incidence of wildfire smoke and the impact on our immediate health that we're seeing now, and sort of what we need to do to protect our immediate health and long-term health because of these situations. I also want to mention that there are also cascading and multiplicative effects of wildfires in the US, right? So yes, it's the fire itself that is devastating to the environment and to communities, but we also have to consider the long-lasting and cascading effects that fires have on humans and the environment. after fires occur and, the sort of impending nature of fires, there are effects to our mental health. There's anxiety, depression, instability in our economic and financial life. So a lot of that happens not just during the wildfire, but can happen afterwards as well, right? We've seen in the sort of picture in the middle there with the sign saying wear a mask, we're seeing two sorts of large natural, quote unquote, natural disasters occurring at the same time. We have the pandemic and we have the fires, and we have to deal with both of them at the same time. In addition, even this past weekend, we've had to deal with heat waves as well. So these events don't occur in isolation, right? They don't occur, okay, we're gonna have a pandemic and then we're gonna have a wildfire and then we're gonna have a heat wave, right? They occur all at the same time, right? And that puts significant stress, not just on our own individual health, but how we respond to these emergencies, response from our healthcare system, and response to our public health infrastructure as a whole, right? As Professor Garbesi had mentioned before, it's not just humans that are being impacted. We rely significantly on livestock, on animals, particularly here in California. They're impacted by the smoke as much as we are, right? And then after all is said and done, when a lot of these large catastrophic fires have gone through the landscape, as Professor Marks has mentioned before, there are some prescribed fires that are good for the environment, but when there's sort of devastation across the board and wiping out large forests, afterwards we can have additional disasters such as mudslides or flooding because the land has been altered so much that we're now prone to additional disasters, right? So when we think about wildfires, yes, we think about the smoke and the air quality, right? But we have to think broader as well about the other impacts that occur during wildfires and also the sorts of public health impacts that occur after wildfires as well. So part of understanding the public health impacts of wildfires is really understanding what we need to know about the health impacts of wildfires and what we need to do to take action, right? So Professor Marks and Professor Garbesi had mentioned some of the effects of reducing, the impacts of climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the ability of large catastrophic wildfires. We also, when those things occur though, we need to take action, right? We have all probably become familiar with the air quality index. We've become familiar with looking online, looking at these colors, looking at monitors to tell us what is the particulate matter concentration in the air right now. And what does that mean in terms of health protective behaviors that I need to use, right? So knowledge is power in this way to help protect your health, right? I have some little screen grabs of, wildfires are coming. A lot of people, even within our CSU EB community have been impacted by the fires directly. What do you need to do to keep you and your family safe? You may have to evacuate, right? And we've seen this time and time again when the border between sort of our built environment and wildland environments are sort of obscured and the fires are, coming into our built environment more and more, right? And then I sort of grabbed this other screenshot from New Mexico, but it sort of identifies things that we should be thinking about in terms of how we address wildfires in reducing their impacts, but also reducing the health impacts associated with devastating wildfires in the US, in California, in general. Okay. And I will end there. I just wanted to do a quick recap, and I wanted to leave some time for questions for all of us. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We have about 8, 10-ish questions. Anybody have anything they want to ask or want the panelists to elaborate on? Sarah?
It looks like John Tyler Williams has their hand up. Go ahead and ask your question.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so my question would be to elaborate for Professor Garbesi, I think that was the pronunciation, I hope. The second professor. She spoke on the equation I equals Pat. I would just wanted her to kind of elaborate on what you said, limit population. I would just like to know more what she means by that.
Okay, so thanks for the question. And I almost want to I'm gonna do a share screen for a minute and see if I can make this happen. So give me just a second and I will do that. All right, share screen. Okay. So the issue here, so you should be able to see this paper, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the IPAT equation is this. I is impact. And the impact is a product of three different things, and they've labeled them cutely, but P is population, and then A is they're calling it affluence, but really that's consumption per person. So consumption per person. And T is, they call it technology, but it's really impact per unit of whatever the thing is that you're consuming. So if we look at CO2 emissions, if the impact we care about is CO2 emissions, we could say, okay, well, let's consider them as the combination of these three things. It's a product of the number of persons times the energy use per person times the CO2 emitted per unit of energy. So that's the way you would, calculate it. Energy winds up falling out of the equation, persons wind up falling out of the equation, and you're left with CO2 emissions. So that's the impact in terms of the amount of CO2 emitted to the environment. So these things multiply each other. And we've had international arguments which have been crazy, destabilizing, and completely sent any kind of possibility to control the problem, off track over the years. We had the affluent countries, so the United States in particular, and to a lesser extent Europe, pointing the finger at the number of persons as being the problem with the global environment. You've got to control population. And then we had people in the less, the poorer countries saying, that's crap. It's the wealthy who have consumed the environment, which is largely true, right? In terms of historic emissions, it really is the affluent who have used it up. Nonetheless, if you have more persons who are affluent, you're going to get more emissions. And regardless, it is actually the product of all three of those. If you can improve technologies by reducing CO2 emissions per unit of energy, then you can reduce the impact too. So you've got to deal with all three of those things at once.
For sure. Yes, no, thank you so much for that part. I'm pretty clear on. I was more specifically talking about, so I've heard of specifically limiting population. So the term you're saying, limiting population. So I've heard of people trying to, I saw a documentary, someone speaking on try to get more female education because they proved that more education in the third world countries for females, they'll have actually less time to have babies. So this is kind of radical, but there's other things that I've heard of. So I'm more asking you, or even spreading out the population into more rural areas. So my question to you, instead of, is have you heard of more ideas of actually trying to tell a third world country or other, less economically developed countries how to not overpopulate?
Well, I think we're fortunately moving into a time where even the low-income countries are realizing that exploding populations are you know, a problem for them as well. But you have to, if you're going to get people to have, there's many things that you have to do. And focusing on women's rights, the right to own property, the availability of birth control. The United States, you know, withdrew from giving contributions to population control programs. So, you know, with all the education in the world, it's not going to do anything if you cannot provide actual birth control, right?
Gotcha.
And particularly if women have no rights. So it's many different things together that can help to address that problem. It's not just one approach, but a big part of that is the affluent countries really taking their responsibility as well, right? You know.
Sure.
So I think part of it is international psychology.
For sure. No, yeah, I agree. So like I said, I've heard some things, and I'm actually pretty interested in people talking about kind of spreading out large cities and kind of bringing, you know, these old decrepit towns that have the old industry and trying to revamp them with renewables, or bringing other old, you know, new industry there with people that are kind of depopulating cities that way, and reintegrating people's ability to farm themselves instead of, so, you know, these mass farms and digging up CO2 and whatnot. So like I said, I'm in agreement. I would, yeah, very interested in if you had any, like I said, any idea or information on things that are happening in the States right now.
People have largely stopped talking about population as part of that equation. I don't think pushing people back into rural areas is going to be, you know, itself an answer. Certainly, it's easier to have a sustainable life if you're living in a rural type area.
Sure.
But we've kind of gone beyond that in terms of having 7.5 billion people. No, it's actually more than now. It's almost 8 billion, 7.8 billion, whatever it is. So on its own, it's not going to be a solution.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and then it looks like, and I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, Janine?
You said it perfect. Awesome. Rock.
Awesome.
Thank you. Dr. Garbesi, first of all, thank you for noting, access to birth control in answer to that last question. Appreciate that. I think that's a good way to frame that. I'm curious about the role. I know that the concept of livestock was brought up, but what is the role of animal agriculture in all of this, and how, you know, we have a lot of big, large scale things. I don't know if anybody else is feeling this, but I'm like, wow, what can we do as individuals? Obviously, that has to be a collective, and I get that. And I appreciate that. But from an individual perspective, what do we do, and how is animal agriculture tied into all of this?
I guess that's for me again.
Anyone, yeah, I think that maybe even the three of you could speak to, because I know there's historical roots for animal agriculture too, but yes, please.
Well, I'll take a stab at it to start out. You know, first of all, you know, we do know that industrial meat production is incredibly energy intensive. When you're raising cows on corn raised, you know, by farm, which is produced with fossil fuels. And so in its current model, meat production is grossly unsustainable. There are all sorts of things that one can do on the energy end as well. You can, sign up for only renewable energy with your utility. You can make your next car an EV that you charge with sunshine. So there are a bunch of important steps you can take as an individual. I'm just saying it alone solve the problem. All that said, I think that if you had far fewer people on the planet, which gets to our earlier discussion, you could produce meat and have people produce meat. You know, meat would be produced on the highlands, which were not suitable to, crop production, because you'd have all this erosion. So if you had sustainable ranging in the highlands and sustainable farming in the lowlands, no objection. If you harvest, traditionally from wild populations, if you do that sustainably, meat production isn't a problem. But when you have 8 billion people on the planet trying to produce more and more meat with fossil fuels, it's an enormous problem. So that's it.
Really quickly, I know I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're supposed to end, at 1:15, but I want to give thanks to also Professor Marks for answering that question in the chat. Someone had asked how California is discussing changing how it manages fire to be more in line with indigenous practices. and he'd answered that indigenous practices are informing the future of California fire management. Post 2018, a lot of new legislation was passed to increase prescribed fire acts across the state, but there's also, of course, like many roadblocks still to like work through. So thank you for answering that. I realize now that 1 hour is probably not enough time to always cover all these topics. So next time we have a panel like this, I'll probably try to extend it longer. I want to give thanks to our panelists for coming and everyone else for attending. Really quick, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to follow us on the club's Instagram at SustainEastBay, or you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We will be posting a recording of this Fireside chat on YouTube, so look out for that if you'd like to revisit these topics. If you'd like more information about SustainEastBay Club, please attend our meeting next Thursday on September 17th. It'll also be during U hour, so from 12:15 to 1:15. And our meetings are usually held every other week. So you can get more information on how to be a member there or anything like that. So I think that's it for today. If we could just give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you so much for coming, and stay safe, everyone.